Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Miyuka Makura. I am a sophomore studying government at the college, and I am a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee here at the Institute of Politics. The Institute of Politics is excited to be a part of this fall's Harvard Votes Challenge, a voter registration competition between Harvard schools. Harvard has partnered with TurboVote to streamline the voter registration process and provide important information about voting deadlines. HKS students can sign up by going to bit.ly/HKSvoter, and all other Harvard students can sign up by going to bit.ly/HarvardVoter. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the Park side and the JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation tonight online by tweeting with the hashtag Transatlantic Forum, which is also listed in your program. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming our guests, Susan Glasser, Wolfgang Ischinger, Kurt Volker, and our moderator, Nicholas Burns. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Nick Burns. I'm a professor here at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'm also a former American diplomat, and it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you here to this conversation on the crisis in the transatlantic relationship. We have an especially good group of people to help us think about this issue and to discuss it and to debate it with you when it comes time for student questions. On my left is Susan Glasser. Susan is a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine, which I think in this administration has become one of the biggest voices about what happens in Washington. She writes a weekly column called Letter from Trump's Washington. Susan, that's the column. She's a veteran journalist. She was the founding editor of Politico magazine. She covered the 2016 election for Politico. She was editor of Foreign Policy magazine. And a longtime correspondent for the Washington Post, where she spent 4 years in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. She got her start as a Harvard College undergrad on the Harvard Crimson, which she informed me today is the oldest daily university newspaper, at least in the United States of America. So Susan, welcome. Thank you for being with us. To Susan's left is Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger. Ambassador Ischinger is the chairman of the Munich Security Conference. In my estimation, the Munich Security Conference, held in the middle of February every year, has become the most important global gathering of anywhere in the world on foreign policy and defense. Under Wolfgang's leadership, it attracts foreign ministers, defense ministers, prime ministers, presidents, even the assorted academics from around the world. Wolfgang is one of the great German diplomats of his generation. He was ambassador to our country, to the United States, at a difficult time in the relationship. He was ambassador to the Court of St. James, to the United Kingdom. He was state secretary, so he was the senior career diplomat. He was the political director of the German Foreign Office, many other accolades and positions. Last but not least, because he's a very close friend of mine and a comrade in arms, is Ambassador Kurt Volker, American Foreign Service officer. Kurt served in a wide range of roles. He was ambassador to NATO for President George W. Bush and President Obama at the beginning of the Obama administration. He was one of our great experts on Europe. Throughout the last 30 years, we served together in several different jobs. And Kurt right now is an active diplomat. He is President Trump's representative to the Ukraine negotiations on the Russian annexation of Crimea and the Russian occupation of the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine. In his private life, he is the executive director of the John McCain Institute at Arizona State University. He was very close to the late Senator McCain. He's also a member of the Atlantic Council Board and other boards. So we've got three people who have lived this relationship. I know a lot, both from the European perspective and the American perspective about what's happening. We've titled this The Crisis in the Transatlantic Relationship because of what's happened. We have a big disagreement across the Atlantic on climate change, where the United States has opted out, the only country in the world not now a party to the climate change agreement. We have a difference on the Iran nuclear deal, where the Trump administration has made the decision, which is its right, to pull out of the deal, but now is threatening, and I think will follow through in imposing secondary sanctions on European companies that do business with Iran. We've had a major disagreement, at least between President Trump and some of the European leaders, over the nature of the European Union. Is it a foe of the United States, as President Trump has said, or is it a partner, as most American presidents, an ally, have seen it? The list is very long. And the first question I have for our panel is, how serious is this crisis? We've had disagreements in the past. The four of us were just talking. The Suez Crisis of 1956, where the United States was in open disagreement with the United Kingdom and France and Israel. The Euro missile crises of the early 1980s that Wolfgang and I lived through as diplomats between the United States and Europe. The Iraq War in 2003, I was ambassador to NATO. Kurt was our lead official on NATO in Western Europe in the State Department. We felt we were very much in opposition, at least to Germany and France and Russia on that. So the question to the three of you is this just one of those periodic generational differences, or is it something more profound? Are we going our separate ways as President Trump talks about Europe in terms that we've never heard? And Wolfgang, maybe I'll start with you on this. He's been a persistent public critic of Angela Merkel. At the same time, he's embraced Kim Jong-un. He said over the weekend in West Virginia, "I'm in love with Kim Jong-un." Those are his words, not mine. He hasn't said that about the European leadership, about NATO, certainly not. I mean, he's been a fierce critic of your chancellor. Help us frame and understand this issue. We'll start with you.
Well, I'm not sure we would be so delighted if he had said, I've now fallen in love with Angela Merkel. Maybe that's not really necessary.
Or with Germany, for instance.
Or with Germany. But more seriously, I think these earlier crises you mentioned, Nick, were generally about one or maybe even several issues, definable issues. This particular crisis appears to be more fundamental. Very fundamental questions have been raised. What about NATO? Is it still useful for the United States, important for Europe? What about our relationship? Are we Europeans a foe, quoting President Trump? Or are we correct when we think of ourselves as probably the United States' most loyal and permanent and dependable friends, even if there are these occasional differences? So finally, what I would say is, as a diplomat, you've got to be, in essence, optimistic. You've got to look for ways out of the crisis. And I've learned to think in terms of, let's not waste a crisis like this. In other words, what are things to learn from this? And one thing to learn from this is that we Europeans need to learn, and I think we are about to learn, that it is not a good idea to believe that for 2 or 3 or more generations, in subsequent generations, we should think that we could outsource essential elements of our security to the country on the other side of the Atlantic. Why would, and I think this is a legitimate question which the Trump administration is raising more forcefully than previous administrations have raised it, why should the farmer in Idaho accept the idea that he should pay the lion's share of defending Europe if the Europeans are now, a lot richer than they were, let's say, in the 1940s or 50s. So this is an important lesson. We need to do more for ourselves and try to make ourselves, us as Europeans, a more respectable and more relevant partner for the United States. That doesn't mean that we should break the relationship. On the contrary, I think we should try to engage, and try to keep the relationship vibrant, but by doing more, not by giving up.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up, Wolfgang, because you've touched on an interesting point. To give President Trump his due, one of the points he's made is that there's an agreement in NATO that each member state, and we have another former American ambassador at NATO, General Doug Lute, Ambassador Doug Lute here with us in the front row, each state will spend at least, as a floor, a minimum, 2% of gross domestic product on defense. And right now, I think, Doug, 8 of the 29 NATO members are spending above 2%. The United States is spending 3.7% of our GDP in defense. Germany, largest economy, is spending, what, 1.2, 1.3% of its GDP. Isn't President Trump right that the American people should expect our allies to do more to defend yourselves?
Oh, absolutely. And I think you mentioned it before. President Trump isn't the first American president. We had Secretary of Defense Gates,
Bob Gates,
in his farewell speech, sent off an important warning shot to us in Europe. We probably didn't listen enough. But I think the key point is we need to do more for our own security, not because the Trump administration is pushing us, but because we should accept the fact that this is our own responsibility. In other words, in a way, this crisis is, I hope, is going to turn out for Europe, for my own country, as a wake-up call. Let's grow up and be responsible for our own destiny to the extent that's possible. We cannot do that in all respects. We cannot constitutionally, under international law, we cannot take care of our nuclear protection needs. That is why NATO, in my view, remains indispensable for our security strategy. But we can do a lot more, and we should do a lot more. I would certainly agree in the areas where we can do something, and that is conventional capabilities.
Kurt, you've also been part of the official relationship. Let me ask you, and then Susan's has the objective truth of a journalist. She can render the verdict. From what I hear Wolfgang saying, this is probably going to pass, that we're in a very difficult period, but it will probably revert to a close relationship whenever President Trump leaves office. He doesn't like the European Union. He sees us as a competitor. He's ambivalent at best about NATO, let's just face it. Do you agree with that, or is this more serious and deeper?
First off, I do fundamentally agree with that. I think this will pass. What Wolfgang started saying at the very beginning was that this crisis is different from others. And I agree with him on that, but for a different reason. This is a crisis where the crisis is inside each of the countries in the transatlantic community. We have these debates internally about populism, nationalism, identity against things like immigration, differences in culture, identity, religion, and so forth. And these are manifesting themselves as very hotly fought contests inside our societies. And you see it in the US, but you also see it in Germany with the AfD. You see it in France with the National Front. The Sweden Democrats just came out of the elections as one of the top parties. So it is something that we are going through, which is shaking the community from inside. That's what I think what makes it different. But I do think we'll come out of it. Why? One of them is if you are able, and I've recently been to Germany, and I know a lot of my German friends are not able, but if you are able to put President Trump to one side and say, what are the policies here that we're doing and talking about, there is a lot more convergence, and in many cases, even people happier with policies than where we were previously. Now, it's very hard, as I said, for people to put the president aside because they just don't like him so much. And he says things that anger them so much. But the actual policies, whether it is on on increasing U.S. military deployments in Europe, on projecting them further forward in the Baltic states, on pushing back on chemical weapons use in Syria and attacking the use of those there, on a stronger and tougher policy on Russia than had been the case. There's a lot of agreement there. You even mentioned the Iran agreement. I remember during the Obama administration, the French coming to me and complaining that they didn't want to do this deal. They thought that this is terrible that we're giving Iran a pass on this program. So they got locked into it. Now you're right. Now they're saying, no, it's bad to tear it up too. But substantively, there's a little bit more common ground there than it appears on the surface. And then the third reason, which I think we all appreciate given our different experiences. I see Carl Kaiser in the audience here as well. The fabric of our relationships between the U.S. and European countries is much, much deeper and more resilient than just governments. Our people, our businesses, our cultures, our ideas, our values, they are completely integrated. And I don't see any way that changes. It's a question of how we navigate challenges day to day as they arise.
So a lot of people are saying, look at the actions of the Trump administration, not at the president's tweets or the president's words. But we're in a situation where the evening of the Helsinki summit, President Trump gave an interview to Tucker Carlson of Fox News. The question from Tucker Carlson was, why should our kids die for Montenegro? Montenegro is a new member of NATO. Why should we go to their defense? And President Trump essentially agreed with the question and cast doubt on whether the United States would respond to defend Montenegro against a Russian attack. And this is a government that was attacked by Russia in real life, an attempted coup d'etat in 2016. Those words, as you well know, as a diplomat, are part of the deterrence of Russia by the United States. And that was on the evening of the day when I think he did turn in the weakest performance of an American president with a Russian leader in the history of our relationship. So isn't President Trump distinct among American leaders in how submissive and soft he's been to Putin?
On the one, I can't think of another U.S. president that would have said that. And you raised consequences about how people feel about things. And I think that's right. I would add a couple other pieces of context here. We just have to take the whole picture in. He's reflecting a train of thought in the United States about why are we putting out so much for this? Why should we put ourselves at risk? Why are we paying so much? This is something that's been there from the, you could go back to George Washington entangling alliances all the way to Vandenberg and
It's in our DNA.
Getting the NATO treaty through the Senate the first time, which was a pretty heavy lift, to President Obama saying allies are freeloaders. So there's a trajectory here. This is part of where the U.S. is coming from. And President Trump is just an extreme expression of that. Another bit of context is that he, in a way he deals with issues, loves to be a contrarian and loves to push and see how people react to that. And we had the example we were talking earlier about trade. He badmouthed the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which was not doing well anyway before he took office.
Free trade agreement
between U.S. and EU, reduced non-tariff barriers. Not doing well in Germany. The Germans were turning against it. Not doing well in France. Not doing well in the U.S. And so he came out and talked down on that agreement. In our political context, the natural arrangement is for the Democrats to be suspicious of trade agreements because of labor standards and environmental standards and protecting U.S. jobs. But President Trump was so thoroughly talking down trade that he ended up getting the Democrats to clamor for him to do more on free trade. And he ends up with an agreement with Juncker in the Rose Garden that is actually lower tariffs on more industries than was the case what we were proposing under TTIP, and everybody's clapping for it. So I'm just saying there's a tactical element to what he does, even though it jars people, such as you mentioned with Montenegro, that then gets our European allies to say, no, that's terrible. We believe in NATO. We care about NATO. And we're even seeing some European allies increase their NATO spending.
Let me just, if I could just turn to Susan Wolfgang, then I'll come to you, because Susan has the advantage, I told her this before, of being completely objective. She hasn't had to represent our government. She's had a keen eye on this relationship for a long time. I just want to get your sense of this big question. Should we be really worried that the transatlantic relationship has been rocked to its core, or are we going to get through this?
Well, let's hope we're going to get through this. Let's at least stipulate that that's our collective aspiration. Thank you, Nick, and thank you to both the panelists. I feel like I've learned so much from both of you over time, and we journalists have the luxury, perhaps, of not being forced to be professionally optimistic. So I'll present a slightly different perspective, and I guess what I would say is, putting aside just for a moment the kind of policy, the nitty-gritty of policy, to me, I do believe that we are in a moment that I never anticipated, in the sense of having a president of the United States attack the fundamental pillars of, call it the liberal international order, call it the transatlantic alliance that the United States has built and sustained, where the rules of many of these institutions, frankly, are rigged on our own behalf. And I think in that sense, listening to the president last week speak at the United Nations, was a fair representation of where we're at in American foreign policy right now. And that is a stunning fact that we're all struggling to grapple with, which is a president who basically has not just a different view, but a radically different view of the role of the United States in the world than I think any of his post-war predecessors, Democrat or Republican. And this goes to Wolfgang's point about previous crises, of which there have been many between the United States and Europe, and which there will be many more in the future. Why is this one different? It strikes me that the President Trump you heard last week was somewhat consistent, not maybe on details, which he is free to, flip-flop on, as all politicians are, but basically pretty consistent in a worldview that I would characterize as not only extremely transactional view of American power, but also one in which the United States essentially might equals right. And he sees a world in which the big powers, and by that he means Russia, he means China, he does not mean the European Union acting collectively, which he disdains as an institution, putting aside his views about NATO. He prefers to deal with Germany individually, with France. He's a bilateral man in a multilateral world. And the consequences, we don't know yet. They could be, for all the reasons that Kurt has outlined, less in the end than the sum of the rhetoric might add up to. But what I come back to, and I think that 20 months in, it's very dangerous to have any illusions about this, is the idea that if your whole analysis of the world right now is don't pay attention to what the President of the United States says over and over and over again, well, we all know how that ends. That doesn't end well. And frankly, the relevant experience for me in trying to analyze and understand this very unusual moment in Washington, in some ways actually has been my experience in Putin's Russia at the very beginning of Putin's presidency, far more so than the 2+ decades I've spent covering Washington politics. At some times, when I look at trying to understand President Trump, trying to sort through the rhetoric versus the actions of the government, and again, I not in any way disagreeing with the specifics on the policy side. I think we all agree that there haven't been drastic moves with regards to Russia, that arguably some moves were taken that President Obama was very reluctant to take. But putting that aside, I think back to President Putin and some of the moves he took to dismantle the early, faltering as they were, imperfect as they were, institutions of democracy that had been built in the first decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I remember when President Putin eliminated elections for governor in all 89 of Russia's regions as a response to a terrorist attack on a school in Beslan in southern Russia by a group of Chechen and other terrorists. And this was a move that had been planned for quite some time, and had you paid attention to President Putin's rhetoric, you would have understood the consequences of that. If you listened and read his famous speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, actually, you would have had a much better sense of the aggressive turn that Russian foreign policy was going to make in the future outside of its own borders.
He compared the U.S. to Nazi Germany in that famous speech at the forum that Wolfgang runs.
So I just, again, I don't discount the good work or even the enormous patriotism of those who are carrying out a Russia policy that seems to be directly at odds with that of the President of the United States right now. But, those people that I've known and learned from who have worked for presidents of both parties, the one thing they've always told me coming out of that experience that they learned was the enormous power, in particular when it comes to foreign policy and national security, vested in the President of the United States, and that's something, I had a lifelong, academic who did not believe in what you might call the great man theory of politics come to me and say, that's the biggest thing I've learned. We were wrong, and in academia, we discount that at our peril.
Yeah. Let me ask you a follow-up question, Susan, because you understand Russia so well. And your whole column is an attempt to understand and capture both the politics and the policy and the mood of President Trump's administration. That Helsinki summit in July, when the president, it's a word I think maybe you used in the column that I used in my introduction, he appeared submissive. He appeared not to be capable of disagreeing with President Trump, even on behalf of our own government, on the question of, did Russia intervene in our election in 2016? How do you explain that? How is it possible that we have this unrelenting criticism of Theresa May and the mayor of London and the chancellor of Germany, the most powerful figure of Europe, and then we have this unrelenting, almost love affair with Vladimir Putin?
And Canada, don't forget Canada.
Justin
our
Trudeau
big
is
new,
public
our big
enemy
new
number
enemies
one
to the north.
in our
Listen,
Alice in Wonderland world.
if every single person in this room had gone to sleep 5 years ago and you woke up and I told you that the Canadians
Are bad.
were our big new, bad guys, how many of you would have believed me? None. This is not a partisan issue. We're talking about something really extraordinary. And we, especially in the foreign policy world, we're used to a very, sort of calm and hyper-rational discourse around this. And we've actually also just come out of what I would characterize as a very technocratic era in Washington. The rise of the behavioral economists and, the notion of we can blink our way into, nudge our way into better policies. Now all of a sudden we're talking about whether it's the 1930s or not. So it's a pretty
Or the
jarring,
War of 1812.
Absolutely. It's, increasingly and terrifyingly, I see people, tweeting and writing this idea that actually America is so divided now, it's a social media era version of the 1850s. I don't know what that means even, but it's very scary.
Let's hope not.
So Helsinki, I was there. You said correctly, and there's no one here, I think, who disagrees that this was a moment unlike any other. There's no American president who would ever speak such words. It's very consistent, however, with this rhetoric, this idea that you're falling in love with the, dictator of North Korea. This isn't hyperbole. This is bunk. I mean, this doesn't fall into what the White House, charitably tries to get us to believe is an unconventional president using unconventional characteristics. Let's be honest. I mean, you don't have to worry about being called a ridiculous partisan to say that's nonsense. And North Korea is the biggest gulag in the world, okay? I feel perfectly comfortable in my ability as an independent journalist, and I'm not sacrificing, that independence to say this is bunk. Same thing with this rhetoric towards Vladimir Putin. People use a shorthand, the public performance that day. What I would like to call your attention to is the fact that I find even more disturbing, which is that we still don't know what really went on behind closed doors between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump at their extensive hours-long conversation there, held at the request of the President of the United States, in which his own government has testified on Capitol Hill. Mike Pompeo was up there, when was that, like about a month ago, under oath, telling the Senate Foreign Relations Committee he's not exactly sure what went on in this meeting. Okay? So obviously, I don't know what is motivating Donald Trump. Perhaps the Mueller investigation will tell us some of the answer, and perhaps it won't. And perhaps it won't. But I think the burden that it imposes on all of us then to try to figure out how do we deal with this. Some Democrats, would say, well, the Kurt Volkers and the people who are inside the administration, they should, the only form of resistance is external because that's the only way to be principled. We have our anonymous author of our anonymous New York Times op-ed who's chosen a different course, potentially. I don't know what the right answer is. That's the beauty of being a journalist. We don't have to say, but I think I wouldn't understate the significance of the United States having become what someone said to me early on last year is the epicenter of global instability. The fact that we don't know what America's policy is towards its allies in Europe or many other places.
So that's interesting, Wolfgang. The German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, has said we can no longer depend on the Americans. Epicenter of global instability. It's a shocking way to think about Washington. Is it that bad? Are the Americans that confusing? Or again, is Kurt right? That if you look at some of these policies, and Kurt represents, I think, a very successful policy and a right one, President Trump has provided lethal assistance to the Ukrainians. President Obama didn't do that. So actions versus words, policy versus style, help us figure that out.
If I may, let me just add one point to what Susan just said. From a European point of view, it is, of course, and I think everybody in Berlin, even Paris or Brussels would agree with what I'm trying to say here. We are all in favor, in principle, of the President of the United States engaging constructively, hopefully, with the President of the Russian Federation. That is an essential European interest to explore maybe opportunities for resumption of arms control or other areas of dialogue and cooperation resolving the Ukrainian crisis, what about Syria, et cetera, et cetera. So we are not against the Helsinki meeting, but we are, like you said, Susan, we're also slightly frustrated by the fact that we have no idea what happened there, and we're not smarter than we were before the meeting. That's very unfortunate. To your question, I would agree more with Susan than with Kurt on this. Of course, facts matter. And of course, we are well advised not only to listen to the tweets, but also look at the facts on the ground. And Kurt is absolutely right. NATO is stronger. There's more reassurance of our Eastern European allies in the Baltic countries, Poland, etc. Yes, but at the same time, and this is why words and tweets matter also, at the same time, trust in the partner United States by Europeans is at an all-time low. In my own country, and I'm the first to regret this, is down to about 9%. I mean, at this moment...
Trust in the U.S.
Trust in the U.S., trust in President Trump. There are probably more Germans today, I mean, it's difficult for me to say this, who would think that they can trust Putin than they believe they can trust Trump. Now, why is this important? It's important because if a situation develops where maybe even the world's biggest power, United States, would like to work again with her European allies and would maybe even need support from and cooperation with the Europeans, it's going to be much harder for European governments to create parliamentary consensus on doing this or not doing that, because we have a commitment with the United States. 9% of trust is, a really bad grade. And I think that my sense is that one important objective of any foreign policy, if you were a small country in Europe or if you are the superpower United States, one important objective has got to be that you want to build trust, you want to create trustful partners, you want to make sure that you have alliances if serious problems arise. And serious problems may arise sooner than we envisage it. What about if the trade war with China evolves into a more serious conflict? Wouldn't the United States be very happy in this situation to have all of Europe on their side rather than on the Chinese side, etc., etc.? So I think that while it is true the Trump administration has done a lot on the ground, but the words and the perceptions have unfortunately gone down the drain.
Boy, that's such an important comment. And Kurt, I want to answer your question, but first I'm going to tell just a very brief story that you and I, 9/11, and Wolfgang talks about friends and allies. On 9/11, Kurt was at the State Department in Washington. I was the ambassador to NATO. When we were hit hard with the attacks on New York and Washington, when the planes hit the Twin Towers, 3,000 people dead, the Pentagon, Pennsylvania, the European allies came to us and they said, we want to invoke Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which had never been invoked in the history of the alliance. An attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. And they came to our support. By the next morning, every one of them had stood up to say, we will fight with you against Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. We invoked it. They all went into Afghanistan with us. Doug knows this. The three of us are all former ambassadors. They all went into Afghanistan with us, and they're still there with us 17 years later. When I called Condi Rice that morning, she was the National Security Advisor, to say, I need the President's agreement that we should invoke Article 5, she said, go for it. I said, but we need the President's agreement. She said, the President had a really bad day, go for it. And she said, before we signed off on the phone, she said, it's good to have allies in the world.
Yeah.
Never forget that. So we've lived it. You've lived it, Wolfgang. Kurt?
There's a follow-on to this story, which is worth telling, because it is relevant to what we're talking about. Once we did that, we created ISAF and went into Afghanistan.
The International Assistance Force in Afghanistan.
Yeah, the United States. Well, it was Operation Enduring Freedom to begin with. And Operation Enduring Freedom was the United States, the UK, and I believe a couple of Australians and a couple of Poles. And we did not ask NATO to do anything. And you and I fought this for a long time.
We can now say.
This is the wrong message to our allies who have offered this help for us to not take it. And it was a hard-fought battle inside the U.S. administration to get the U.S. to the point of agreeing to there being an ISAF and then agreeing that OEF and ISAF would eventually merge together. It took
in 2003.
years.
Yeah.
And what does that tell you? That tells you that these trends and things that we're dealing with today are trends and things we were dealing with 15 years ago.
So let's go to an issue that you're working on directly. And then on Ukraine, then I want to get both of your views on Putin and Russia, again, what we should do. Kurt, candidate Trump said in the 2016 campaign to the New York Times, I might recognize Russia's annexation of Crimea. What's the big deal? But then President Trump has pursued a tougher policy. Do you see him not backing down on that, continuing to support an independent Ukraine, continuing to support lethal assistance? You're the face and lead diplomat. How do you see that moving forward?
Well, I do see this in the context of under the current administration adopting a much tougher policy on dealing with Russia.
Than President Obama.
If you think, rewind the clock. In 2009, we had the big reset button. I had been ambassador when we suspended the NATO-Russia Council. We launched the NATO-Georgia Commission. We were pursuing missile defense against rogue missile threats in Poland and Czech Republic. And some of our allies were very concerned about not letting go, not giving in on Georgia. This is a major invasion, major seizure of territory. Czechs were in that position. Lithuanians were in that position. Other allies, Germany, said, "Oh, we can't not have a dialogue with Russia. We have to have a dialogue with Russia." The Obama administration came in with Secretary Clinton, the Secretary of State at the time, just washed right over this. Resume the NATO-Russia Council, no follow-through on Georgia. We had set up this talks in Geneva about how to try to resolve this. Basically, they went fallow. Russia to this day, 10-year anniversary, this past month, Russia to this day has not implemented the ceasefire agreement from 2008.
Of its invasion of
Its invasion of Georgia. So even in 2012, you remember the debate with Mitt Romney where he was ridiculing Romney for saying Russia's the principal strategic threat the country faces. So it was a long time up until after Crimea for the Obama administration to then start to ratchet up on Russia. The Trump administration basically started there and has done more, including expelling more diplomats, shutting down the consulate in San Francisco, lifting the arms embargo on Ukraine, increasing sanctions on Russia, increasing exercises and defense planning with Georgia and Ukraine. There's been a lot of movement in that direction. What I have to say is that every step of this was approved by the president. So somehow we have to say, what Wolfgang says, these are the tweets, these are the words, what you say, the Tucker Carlson interview. And yet every step here, we would not be doing lethal arms sales to Ukraine if the president hadn't approved it. So there is something here.
Yeah. I would just say this. There's no question President Trump, I think, has been courageous on Ukraine. He's pursued the right policy. It's a tough policy, and he deserves credit for it. On the sanctions, President Trump did not favor implementing sanctions, but the Senate voted 98-2, and the Republican Party was completely against the president. They wanted sanctions, kind of pushed into it.
Yeah.
But I laud you, Kurt, for the work you're doing here. We're proud of what you're doing. Wolfgang and Susan, you've both dealt with the Russians your whole lives, professional lives. Are we back to containment of Russian power as long as Putin is the leader of the Russian Federation? Is that what our strategy, Germany, NATO, the U.S. should be?
Well, I guess I'm not so sure I like the word containment because it would indicate that we're back to the Cold War, which we are not really. But the philosophy that was the essence of containment, namely a mix of sufficient and credible defense or deterrence with a continuing offer of dialogue if the other side wants to engage, is, I think, the correct approach to the current situation with Russia. And unfortunately, let me just add that I think we have so far played this right, even though some of our allies felt that the famous NATO-Russia Founding Act of the mid-90s should now be thrown into the waste bin because the Russians are not really adhering to it. We have essentially maintained the clauses of that agreement. In other words, indicating to the Russians that we want to leave the door open.
Exactly.
And we stick to our commitments. So if you want to stick to your commitments, you'll be welcome. So far, we have not had we've had zero response essentially from the Russian side, which means for me that we will probably have to exercise what I can only call strategic patience and wait for better weather in Moscow, which may take a long time.
So can I do this is a great example of transatlantic harmony here, because I completely agree with what Wolfgang just said. And that's the reason I cringe at the word containment too, because it implies we've given up hope. And we shouldn't give up hope.
Of a change in Russian attitude.
Of a change in Russian behavior.
Well, again, look, we still don't know the answer to how the Trump story ends. And to me, that is really the crucial piece of information here, because I guess I don't disagree with anything that either of you has said, although I think it's a fair point that you haven't yet convinced me the basic question of whether President Trump agrees with the Trump administration's Russia policy. And it's
it
not
that bad?
Well, it's not just on the sanctions, where it seems to me he clearly was opposed to them, and that was a constraint imposed upon him by the politics of Washington. Same thing goes arguably on the expulsion of the diplomats. I and others have reported that he was very unhappy to learn how many diplomats the U.S. was expelling, and felt that Germany and France weren't doing enough, and was extremely reluctant, in fact, to join in that. He's never publicly criticized either Putin or Russia in a vehement way over the nerve gas attack inside the United Kingdom in ways that was a major crisis for our nominally closest ally. But put that aside; those are quibbles, because basically I do agree with the characterization of where the policy is at. I think it still understates the radically different view of the world that the President of the United States holds right now. Now, again, it's not the view of the American foreign policy establishment in either party. It is not the view of our allies in Europe. But it seems to me that on the basic question of where the U.S. is in the world and how it projects power, that President Trump is far closer to Vladimir Putin's view of the world, which essentially is almost a 19th century view of great power competition. Certainly Trump wouldn't articulate it in those terms, but actually Putin for a long time has been articulating not so much a return to the Soviet Union, although he is very much a creature of the Soviet Union and a product of the Soviet era KGB, but it seems to me that his foreign policy views are much more around returning Russia to its great power status of the late 19th century, this idea of a multipolar world in which great powers and might equals right on the world stage. That, to me, think about President Trump and his words where, essentially strength is the value that he seems to hold highest above all when it comes to international relations and the countries he admires. And I think that's very, very similar to the rhetoric we've always seen from Vladimir Putin when it comes to, again, this notion of how powers operate, which is my long-winded way of getting back to this question about containment. Because it seems to me that it would be consistent with both the Putin/Trump view of the world or with the much more alliance-driven NATO view of the world that we might end up in this same place where we are right now for very, very different reasons. There's no reason to believe that this philosophy of the United States in the world, this aspect of Trumpism, may or may not survive the presidency of Trump the man when it comes to the United States. Right now, it is not a majority viewpoint in either party, I don't believe. But I would leave you with this idea that I do think President Trump's challenge to the world order is that it is very radically different of a worldview than any other American president.
So, Susan, you have said so many interesting things tonight. We got to go to student questions. We want to do that. I got to ask you one more question. We had a Harvard conference, Carl Kaiser and I, and others in Madrid and Segovia in July. And one of the takeaways, we had 25 Europeans, 25 Americans. One of the takeaways for me was that the Europeans were essentially telling us our existential threat is this threat from within our societies of anti-democratic populists. It's Alternative for Deutschland and Wolfgang's home country and Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders, the governments of Hungary and Poland. And the Europeans were telling us, not only is your country's not on the sidelines, your country is actively aiding the anti-democratic populists. And they were talking about President Trump's embrace of Salvini in Italy, embrace of Viktor Orban, embrace of the Polish government. Again last week in the UN speech, praise for the Poles, criticism of the Germans. What's going on? I mean, how do you explain that? That's about what we believe in. Do we believe in democracy and the rule of law or not?
Well, again, that's the challenge that President Trump makes the world order. I don't diminish the policy decisions that have been made by those serving inside the Trump administration. But in fact, the very first person, that President Trump met when he was president-elect Trump was Nigel Farage. And,
Trump Tower.
you know, he has very explicitly at times sought to create the notion of a sort of populist international with himself at the head of it. And, you know, I don't know that he's going to actually do that. You have Steve Bannon in exile running around, you know, encouraging this idea. It seems to me that, yes, that is part of the threat, and I wouldn't discount it. The idea, not only, it's one thing to say, well, I'm a more pragmatic U.S. leader, I'm a, you know, in the mold of Nixon, I'm gonna, you know, be more of a realist when it comes to not stressing democracy and human rights, for example, as pillars of our foreign policy. But it's an extraordinary thing to have the President of the United States not appearing to believe that democracy and human rights play a role in American foreign policy. And I believe that there's no evidence really to suggest that that is anything other than occasionally opportunistically the case right now. You know, and that is something that many of us never thought we would see.
Right. Thank you to all of you, Kurt, Wolfgang, Susan. Let's go to student questions for those of you. We have microphones on the floor, 2 on the floor, 2 in the first balcony. Please just line up behind the microphones if you'd like to ask a question. This gives me an opportunity to say this conversation is going to continue this weekend. We have the German-American Conference, the annual conference organized by our German and European students, is going to be held this Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. They have a host of senior officials coming from Germany. And a lot of Americans and Canadians and Europeans with them. If you go to www.germanamericanconference.org, you can secure your tickets for this great event. It's a terrific event, and we thank our German students for taking the lead. And for the questioners, if you could just tell us your name, maybe where you're studying, make sure that your question has a question mark at the end of it. Yes.
Hello, my name is George Kent. I'm a freshman in the undergraduate college here. My question is, so ever since Russia invaded eastern Ukraine and annexed Crimea, the Minsk negotiations have been tasked with trying to settle the conflict and resolve the issues in that area. How effective, with Russia breaking ceasefires here and there, and well, more than here and there, but with
daily.
How effective do you see the Minsk process in stabilizing the region and bringing a peace to that area?
Right. Thank you, George. We have the American negotiator right here to answer your question.
So I think the Minsk agreements are very important for a couple of reasons. One, it is still the framework by which Russia affirms that the territory of the Donbass should be restored to Ukrainian territorial control and sovereignty. That's very important. Second, the failure to implement the Minsk agreements is the basis on which the European Union and the United States maintain sanctions on Russia over this failure. So it is a very important framework. In addition, all of the things you would need to see happen to see the conflict peacefully resolved and the territory restored to Ukraine are in there. So there's nothing lacking inside the agreements. What is lacking is the political will to implement them. Russia continues to deny that it is responsible for what's happening in the conflict. And because of that, you see no movement at all. That creates a dynamic where the Russians point to the Ukrainians and say, you're not implementing the political steps under Minsk. The Ukrainians point to the Russians and say, you're not implementing the security steps under Minsk. What we have proposed is to put in place a UN-mandated peacekeeping mission which would replace the Russian forces. It would create security throughout the entire contested area and create the time and the space where these agreements could then be implemented. And if we were able to do that, it would actually be successful in getting the territory back to Ukraine. But since we don't have Russia's agreement to any of that right now, the conflict is as it is.
Thank you.
And a logical follow-up to George's question would be, Kurt, so the Russians have agreed that eventually, that they're on Ukrainian territory in the Donbass, but they've annexed Crimea, as George reminded us. They have a firm view that they're going to keep that forever?
Yes.
What can we do about that?
Not accept it. And Nick, you know, you almost made it to Estonia as ambassador before getting launched into bigger things.
Yeah.
But what we did in 1940 Acting Secretary of State Sumner Welles issued a declaration after Russia's forcible takeover of the Baltic states, saying this is a brutal act and we will not accept it, we will not recognize it. And that lasted for 51 years until the Baltic states regained their independence. Nobody knew in 1940 how important that was. But by the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, it was tremendously important that we had never given that ground. And that's exactly why Secretary Pompeo on July 25th of this year issued a Pompeo Declaration to reiterate that the United States does not and will not recognize Russia's forcible incorporation of Crimea into the Russian Federation.
And I'll point out, because Ambassador Volker is too diplomatic to do so, but very interesting example of exactly what we've just been talking about. That declaration was issued in the immediate aftermath of the Helsinki summit. And it's certainly, you could read it, I read it, I think others did too. I think it was meant to be read as a declaration that whatever the very uncomfortable surround sound of the president's meeting with President Putin earlier that week, that in fact there is an American policy that may well continue for decades after this moment in our political life has passed. I don't know how significant it will ultimately end up to be, but I would call your attention to the interesting timing and juxtaposition between those two events. The president seeming to question Article 5 at the very same time that this declaration is made by his government.
And let me just say, George, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State responsible for Ukraine and Russia is George Kent.
Are
So
you
you should look him up.
George Kent?
He's my dad.
That is fantastic. George Kent Sr. is a graduate of Harvard College, and he's one of our great diplomats. Would you give him our best wishes? And we're going to tell him he should be proud of you, too.
Busted.
Just only at Harvard. Can I just say, too, we're going to go to the next question. I think Kurt and I lived this. Wolfgang did, too. I think one of the most remarkable things I ever witnessed, the Baltic diplomats who arrived in the 1930s in Washington as representatives of independent countries. This came after Versailles. Ernst Jakobsen was the Estonian ambassador to the United States during the Roosevelt administration. And Anatol Dinsberg, the Latvian ambassador, they stayed for 51 years in Washington, waiting for their countries to be freed from Soviet tyranny. And I remember when we brought them into the Oval Office to meet President George H.W. Bush in September 1991 when they were reasserting their independence. Can you imagine the faith for half a century to stay with it? And we never closed their embassies the way some countries did.
That's right.
And so there is a lot to think about here, Kurt, about Crimea, about your point, not giving in to the Russians. Thank you for that. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you all. This has been a very interesting panel. It's been very interesting for me. My name is Daniel Shapiro. I am a first-year master's student, specifically studying regional studies, Russia, Eastern Europe, Central Asia through the Davis Center. And my question is also for you, Mr. Volker. It's kind of a similar question to the previous one. Namely, for each of the players, or the major parties in the conflict, the Ukraine conflict, and the key external stakeholders, so here we're talking, Ukraine, Russia, the separatists, US, and the EU, what do you think are the minimal requirements or conditions that are necessary for these parties to move toward resolving the conflict? And do you think that Minsk II properly addresses these concerns?
Well, first off, I can't agree that Russia is an external party.
I meant just in the conflict. And
Russia's a protagonist. Russia is running the conflict.
Yeah.
So all the forces that are there are under Russian command and control. The two political entities are selected and controlled by Russia. So they're the protagonist here. What is minimally acceptable for Ukraine, for Europe, for the United States, is that the territory of the Donbass is restored to Ukrainian control, and it is reincorporated, if you will, under the Ukrainian constitution, with obviously all the safeguards of human rights and amnesty for people who fought during the war, special status within Ukraine, as the Minsk agreements say, all of that. But that's kind of what's minimally acceptable. For Russia, they do not accept that at this point. They say they do on paper. But the reality is, I think what Russia wants is a Ukraine that is part of Russia's orbit, and where you have a friendly government in Ukraine toward Russia again. And that hasn't happened since they invaded Ukraine, and in fact, I would argue they've made it less likely. They have forged a Ukrainian identity that is stronger, more nationalist, more unified, more westward-looking, more anti-Russian than ever existed in the history of Ukraine. And that's going to continue for as long as Russia occupies this territory. So I hope we get to a point where Russia also accepts that that minimal standard of just restoring these territories to Ukraine is a basis for Russia actually getting closer to what it wants, which is a better relationship with Ukraine.
Wolfgang.
Can I just underline what Kurt said? I had the privilege of being sent into the Ukrainian situation in the early spring of 2014 to work on behalf of the OSCE chairman, trying to prepare for the presidential elections, which then led to the election of President Poroshenko, etc. So I had the opportunity of traveling around the country quite a bit, and I'm a witness to the fact that before this crisis, of course, you could have argued that maybe Ukraine didn't really have a single national identity. There was the western part of Ukraine, which was more, Catholic and more oriented towards the old Habsburg Empire, and there was the eastern part, which was more Russian-speaking and maybe more leaning toward their Russian friends on the other side of the border. What Putin has produced single-handedly, by way of the annexation of Crimea and by way of the activities which Kurt just described, is to, first of all, produce a national identity. I saw, even as early as early May of 2014, I saw little Ukrainian flags, on private homes, even in places where you would not have expected that, east of Kiev, not only in the western part. He has single-handedly turned this now more unified country with an identity into a country which has one main concern, namely Russia. In other words, what a great accomplishment to turn your single biggest Western neighbor, who actually is used to be part of the Soviet Union. Many of the people in Ukraine speak Russian, and he managed to turn his biggest Western neighbor into a country that fears nothing more than Russia. Great accomplishment, success story, if you wish.
Okay, yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Dominic Bullers. I'm an MBA student here at the Kennedy School. I also work for the German Ministry of Defense, and right now I work for one of Professor Burns' projects as well. And my question is to Ambassador Ischinger. You hinted at that. There's another player in the room that we're not talking about, an elephant, so to speak. It's China. And basically, we are, as the Western world, turning a lot inwards. We're thinking about ourselves, our relations, our internal policies. And at the same time, China is very clever at doing, divert and conquer. And they have just last year, I think, opened the first military station abroad on the Arabian Peninsula. They've started somewhat a World Trade Bank that, after some words contrary to the same, many European countries have joined. So actually, what do you think could be a comprehensive approach against that? Should we look as Europeans, but I'm also interested in the American perspective, should we as Europeans actually look for a comprehensive strategy against China, or should we accept that China might be the better partner for us along the road?
My turn?
You and maybe I think Susan,
okay.
I'm sure, has some thoughts on this too. Thank you.
Well, I'll be very brief. First of all, the idea that China, I think this was an idea presented in particular at Davos a year or so ago, when Xi Jinping spoke at Davos, and he was presented as the new leader of the liberal international order. I think that's a joke. If you know a little bit about what's going on in China, we need to work, and we have a great interest in working with China, but China is not, in terms of our values, our fundamental principles, a possible partner in the same way that hopefully the United States and Western Europe will continue to be partners, Trump or not Trump. So I think we should have no illusions. Should we have, what should we do? We in the European Union need to develop a strategy on China, which we don't. We have a German commercial approach to China, which says essentially, let's sell automobiles. But we have not yet developed anything that looks like a strategy on, say, the South China Seas, on Chinese behavior in the Asia-Pacific theater, etc. The only way forward, I think, is if we in the European Union can turn French strategy on China, British strategy on China, well, the Brits will be out, so German strategy on China, etc., into a coherent European strategy. Step one. Step two, and here is where I think there is a great opportunity for transatlantic cooperation. If we managed to come up with a somewhat coherent European approach to China, then I think the next challenge is to establish the closest possible coordination about this with the Trump administration or its successor. If we can work together in making sure that there will be no military conflict with China, that we will develop a relationship that is mutually beneficial, but where we make sure that our own interests are maintained, whether it's in intellectual property or in preserving industrial secrets or in preventing cyber espionage, etc., etc., etc. We have in Europe come a little late in finding out that even as we speak, the Chinese presence in Europe is such that China could probably even today in 2018 prevent a decision in the European Union from being taken that would tend to be a sort of anti-Chinese decision. The leverage that China has been able to establish in certain European countries is already significant. So this is a very interesting new challenge, and I would be very interested in establishing a close consultation framework between us in the European Union and the United States in trying to manage this relationship in the future.
I mean, just a sort of two-sentence observation on that. I think a lot of people expected that would be the route that the Trump administration would take. President Trump, if you listen to Steve Bannon, you know, that China all along was sort of the longer-term geopolitical threat that they seem to be wanting to mobilize American policy around, both on an economic and in a security front. I think a lot of people, therefore, were surprised at the sort of tactical fires he's said, and you know, kind of at least rhetorical battles with European allies, Canadian allies, at a time when you would think you would want a more united front on China. It strikes me that that is a consistent through line for President Trump, is to perceive China as the big threat. But the flip side is, if you look at his, again, I come back to his views of strength in the international order and the idea that the great powers like China and Russia are the only worthy essential partners of the United States. And so those are competing impulses in a way that I see. I don't know that they'll all play out in the course of 1 4-year term. Obviously, if Trump is reelected and there's 8 years, we'll see a lot more and understand more clearly which of those contradictory impulses win through. You know, is he the guy who's going to take on China for global dominance, or is he the person who's more determined to shatter and blow through the constraints and webs of multilateralism that we've bound him by in his first few years.
We've said a lot of tough things, I have, about President Trump tonight. I think he's got a lot of support in this country for his
Right.
sanctions against China, his trade actions against China. A lot of support internationally from countries that can't stand up to China. And I think maybe some in Europe and even in this hemisphere are kind of hoping that President Trump can coerce the Chinese to a more reasonable position. It's been such a great discussion. We're almost out of time. Let me just suggest there's 3 people. Ask your questions. We'll just listen to each question. I'll ask each of you to select one of those questions. We'll do it very briefly because we've got to leave in literally 5 minutes. Please.
Quick question in relation to the Serbia and Kosovo proposal to exchange territory, the view that Germany has taken in relation to that question as opposed to the view of the US government, and it seems, according at least to the New York Times today, the possible EU view, which is more in line with the US rather than the German view.
Thank you. So this would be for Wolfgang, who was actually the negotiator on Kosovo independence. Do you favor the proposed land swap between Kosovo and Serbia, population swap, if you will, in order to normalize their relationship? We'll get back to that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, there's another important area of disagreement between the U.S. and the EU, not just in rhetoric, but in action as well. The president has moved the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, something that all European countries have staunchly opposed. He's closed the PLO delegation office in Washington, and he's cut off all aid to Palestinians. Germany, to its credit, has promised recently to make up the deficit in the UNRWA budget. But can the EU step up and do more for a fair disposition for Palestine? And is it possible, really, at this point, to revive or resurrect the quartet process, or is it just completely defunct?
Okay.
Susan lived in Jerusalem, so.
Very, very briefly.
Would you like to take that?
Sure.
Okay. Final question.
Thank you. My name is Dan Creamer. I'm a student at the Fletcher School, Tufts University. I had a question about what I think is another crisis in the transatlantic relationship, specifically Brexit. Obviously, Britain is probably the most important bilateral relationship with the United States. It looks like we're steaming towards a hard Brexit, which has some serious potential financial repercussions, as well as knock-on effects of other governments that may be interested in leaving the Eurozone, see Italy. Thank you.
Very good. So
Okay.
any one of you could have answered any of the questions, but I think, Wolfgang, you'll take the first. Susan will take the second. Kurt, you're going to be the final word. Wolfgang.
All right. On the Serbia-Kosovo issue, first, under existing rules, including the Charter of Paris of 1990, it is not impossible to change borders if that happens peacefully and if everybody agrees. That actually happened in the case of the separation of the Czech Republic from Slovakia, and that was totally okay. Why are some of us in Europe, including myself, extremely skeptical about the idea of a land swap? Even if the land swap were implemented, it would not eliminate the existence of pockets of Serbs in Kosovo. The problem would be that the number of Serbs in Kosovo would be severely reduced, and the existence of these people would probably, in my estimation, be more at risk than in the current situation. You would be tending toward a kind of an ethnic, pure Serbia and an ethnically pure Kosovo. That is not the way we want countries to come into the European Union. The principle of the European Union is that we are countries that are in favor of diversity in all respects. And the second argument, very briefly, is the Pandora's box argument. What if a land swap between Serbia and Kosovo would lead to, let's say, the Bosnian Serbs to propose that instead of being part of the not appreciated country of Bosnia and Herzegovina, they would like to also go into a kind of border change and become part of Serbia. And what would that then mean to the relationship between Kosovo and Albania and Macedonia? In other words, all hell could break loose. Don't underestimate the fact that in this part of southeastern Europe, nothing is totally quiet. We have had war recently, and we have had ethnic strife recently. And it is our principal, I think, duty and challenge and concern to make sure that war or conflict will not break out again, and that this part of southeastern Europe will eventually, gradually, be able to join the European Union, where borders play less a role than in the past, and where ethnic differences will hopefully disappear over time. This is why I think, and Chancellor Merkel and others also believe, that we should advise against a land swap. The reconciliation between Serbia and Kosovo must be possible without such a land swap. And it is possible, believe me.
Thank you for the clarity of that issue on a complex subject. Susan, the question on Jerusalem was, if the Trump administration has abandoned, and that's the right word, the position of the United States from Harry Truman to Barack Obama, all presidents, can the EU make up for the void created by the United States in terms of engaging the Palestinians?
Yeah, I'm going to give a short answer, and the answer is no. I mean, I think that what we're talking about here is both on Israel and the Palestinians, arguably even on the Iran deal as well. What you see is the United States reversing or backing away from positions it's held up until very recently, and people looking toward Europe. But I'm deeply skeptical about that for many different reasons. Many of them, I think, not necessarily poorly reflecting upon Europe, but what is it built to do? And I think, for example, on the Iran deal, I've certainly spoken with many European diplomats who believe that eventually this will be the end of the Iran deal, even though for now the other world powers who were parties to this have stuck with it. For now, the Iranians themselves have also stuck with it. But the bottom line is that there's just too much of an asymmetry of power. I think the same thing holds true when you look at Israel and the Palestinians. The Trump administration has, I think, in an interesting way, chosen to abandon what they would call the fiction of the past, of the sort of false neutrality of the United States, the idea that we would be a party in the middle brokering peace between Israel and the Palestinians. We've declared ourselves very firmly on the side not only of Israel, but of this particular Israeli government. What does that mean for peace? People who are long-term observers of this do not think it has enhanced the possibility of an independent peace. President Trump, on the other hand, who once said it would be very easy to come up with a solution to this conflict, promises us again, as recently I believe as last week, that any day now, or perhaps in right after the election, he'll be producing a peace plan. It strikes me that again, what we're looking for is for Europe, as it is currently constituted, to step in to the void or the vacuum that the U.S. either withdrawal or change in position has offered on a variety of issues right now. I don't see that immediately happening, even though you saw the very interesting response from Chancellor Merkel after her first encounter at a NATO summit with President Trump last year, giving that very interesting speech in which she said perhaps it's time for Germany and for Europe to take more responsibility upon itself. I don't think these institutions are built certainly for that to happen overnight. And so in the short term, I would say we can have a pretty clear answer of no. We'll have to see what the more longer term brings on that question.
I wish we could end with hope, but we're talking about
Brexit. Yes, I was just going to say.
Your view. Is it going to happen? Is it not going to happen? Second referendum?
The clouds are definitely darkening over Brexit here. The problem is that a majority of people in the UK voted for not being in the EU, but they didn't have a common view as a majority as to what they want the UK to be. And as a result, there is no vision that has led Britain out of this. There have been different angles and proposals on that, from the UKIP party to Boris Johnson to the Prime Minister Theresa May. Many people are still saying we need to have another referendum. This is all a mistake. Find it very hard for a parliament or a democratic government to do that. The Norwegians tried this once, and it became not only a no, but a hell no. And I think that would be a worry about doing it again in the UK. Europe does have a history of doing things at the 11th hour. It is possible that they will salvage something at the last moment.
There could be an agreement between the EU.
An agreement to
and the UK.
extend.
Yeah.
That's the classic one. Remember the Stockholm Conference in 1985, where they just stopped the clock, literally stopped the clock. So I think there are ways out that they might find at the 11th hour to prevent a catastrophe. But even today, you're seeing the costs of the uncertainty. I met with someone from Panasonic last week who said that they decided to move their European headquarters from London to Amsterdam just because they wanted to avoid the uncertainty, just in financial flows and managing the money side of the business. They just didn't want it to be in London anymore.
I wish we could leave you with hope.
Well, there is hope. There is hope. I'm
Please.
gonna answer the question you asked me earlier, which is
Hope.
John McCain. John McCain was a unique figure here, and I think the one thing, if I could single out, that he understood in this set of topics that very few other people understood or articulate the same way, is that our values are our interests, and our interests are our values. There's no separation between supporting democracy, human rights, rule of law, economy, security, and also supporting hard-nosed national security policy and global security. And when you see it that way, it means that we cherish our allies because we're doing the same things together.
We end on hope and wisdom. Kurt Volker, Wolfgang Ischinger, Susan Glasser, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.